All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first ePrime live stream of the new year. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the Product Service and Support Coordinator. I'm the training coordinator for the Product Service and Support team. And today we're going to talk about UDP communication in ePrime. Now, if you've been watching some of our other live streams, what we've been doing in the past is we actually added to the newest version of ePrime 3 a way to receive signals from UDP communication. Now, before I jump into all of that and how that actually works, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between TCP and UDP communication. As you know from the past, we've been able to receive signals from TCP communication in ePrime as far back as ePrime 2 without really any hassle or really any worry. But only recently did we update ePrime 3 to include communication by way of receiving data from UDP communication. So to demonstrate some of why this problem happens, I actually brought in my good friend Brian, who's going to help us demonstrate the difference between TCP and communication, or TCP and UDP communication. So you want to come on over here, Brian? Hi.
Hello.
So now we're going to demonstrate TCP communication in ePrime.
Can I borrow a pen, please?
Sure thing, Brian. Here's a pen.
Wow, thank you.
You are welcome. So that's TCP communication. It needs sort of a handshake in order for it to work. So they need to verify that the data's been sent. So now we're going to demonstrate UDP communication in ePrime.
Can I borrow a pen, please?
Of course you can.
Gee, thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. So that's just our kind of quick and easy way to demonstrate TCP and UDP communication. And as you can see, thanks, Brian. As you can see, there might be a little bit of a problem with UDP communication in ePrime. Where TCP communication, it has something called a handshake, where it actually waits until it receives the data, or in our little example there, the pen. It waits till it receives the data and it sends it in a very structured communication type. But as far as UDP communication is concerned, it's basically referenced or basically called connectionless. There's actually no call in order for UDP to connect. It kind of just sends out data. And the network interface doesn't really know what it's listening to. So if you've ever done ipconfig on your computer is kind of the standard that we use to find what IP addresses we're communicating with in ePrime, or we're communicating with in general. If you've ever done ipconfig, you can see that we have a whole bunch of IP addresses that are actually listed as possible IP addresses to send data to. UDP doesn't actually know which one of those it's talking to. It just sends the data out and it just says, okay, well, here's all of my data. And it leaves it up to the receiving signal to kind of take that data. Now, the benefit is it is a much faster way of communicating. As you saw when Brian received the pens for the UDP communication, he received a lot of them very quickly. But he didn't necessarily pick up all the pens that he got. So with UDP, they don't necessarily get all of the data packets, and really UDP doesn't really care about that. It's just about getting the data to you as quickly as possible. So we actually have, and the reason for this webinar today, or this live stream, is because I do want to draw attention to a new article and some new samples that we have that demonstrate how this works in ePrime 3 in a really cool way. So this is the article that we have here. It's called Socket Communication in ePrime 3. Now, the way that it works is we actually have a really nice description here of how socket communication works in ePrime 3 with a really great example of how it would look. Now, if you look down at the very bottom here, we've actually included a sample, and that's kind of what the focus of today's webinar is going to be, is specifically this sample and how it works and even what's included. Because if you look at this sample, we actually have a new program in there that we made just to kind of internally test that this is working. So I have it downloaded to my desktop here, and I'll show you guys. The first thing we're going to do is we're just going to talk about simply sending UDP communication signals. So I'm going to go ahead and open this in eStudio. Now, if you take a look in here, I have a secondary program here called ePrime Socket Device Test. Now, this is that kind of other program that I had mentioned that we made that's included as a part of this sample. The purpose of this program is to test whether or not the sending and receiving of UDP triggers is actually working. Now, the really nice thing that we've done with this sample is we've actually included exactly how to talk to this sample and exactly how to talk to this other application in the sample itself. So I'll give you a quick rundown on how this sample works. So as you can see, very simple. Everything's just on the session proc. This isn't, a psychology experiment. This isn't something that we recommend you run participants through. This is just the very most basic way to say, hey, I am now sending and receiving data. So in this case, we are sending data. So there's this little README file here that we'll get to a little later, but it tells us how to set up that extra application to hear the UDP signals that we're sending with this application. So the first thing we have is introduction. It's just a simple text display object. Just as this experiment will send 3 strings via task events. Press any key to begin. If you take a look at the properties page for this, you can see that it's a duration set to infinite, and it's waiting for a keyboard response. Data logging is currently set to none, and because it doesn't really matter on this particular object. Now, where the bulk of all of this sample comes from is this send data text display object. So right now it just says sending data. There doesn't really need to be anything more graphic on the screen or anything more descriptive. You just need to know that it is sending data, because all of the data that's being sent is actually going to show up in that other application that we have. And let me show you how the triggers work in here. So if we go into the properties page in the top left-hand corner, and then go ahead and go all the way over to, let's go to duration input first. You can see that there is a duration of infinite, and that it is waiting for any key press in order to exit. And it says here, press any key to exit. So this can honestly be on screen as long as you want. But the number of triggers that it sent are very limited. So if I go over to task events, we can see the limited number of triggers that we're sending. So right here we have a task event for send data, which is the name of this text display object, .onset time. We have a task event with 0 millisecond delay, and our task is linked to the socket device. Now, the socket device is in fact where the TCP and UDP communication come from. In this case, the UDP communication is happening strictly from that socket device. Now, the action that we're doing right now through the socket device is write string. Our source is going to be custom and not timestamp. And our custom source that we're going to send is just a string that says sent at onset. So if this UDP communication is sent correctly, then in our other application that we run, and I'll show you how to set that up in a second, the other application that we run is actually going to receive the words sent at onset. And that's how we know that, hey, this was the first trigger that we got here, the first type of signal that we sent from this object. Now, if you look, we have another onset time. This one is, again, a socket. It's write string, and this one is now sent at 250. And the reason that we say it's sent at 250 is you go ahead and take a look at this delay part right here, this delay property. This delay property is actually set to 250 milliseconds. So what ePrime's doing is it's waiting 250 milliseconds after the onset of the object, and then it's going to send this custom trigger here. So sent at 250. So then our other application is going to receive those words. And finally, we have the last send data.onset time task event. And if you see here, we have a delay of 500 milliseconds this time. Again, another socket write string. And the custom here is just going to be sent at 500. So we're actually just going to get 3 strings from this program to our socket, just sent at onset, sent at 250, and sent at 500. So this object only needs to be on the screen for 500 milliseconds, and then you're going to be good. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK to get out of all of that. And we'll go ahead and take a look at how the socket device is actually set up in ePrime. So if I go over to my devices tab here and then take a look at the socket device, which I added, you can see here that I have just socket. The server is going to be localhost because I'm communicating with this computer. I'm not actually communicating with a different computer, and I'm going to be pointing the other application directly at this port number here in order for me to receive those signals. And I have connection type UDP. You would, of course, manipulate the connection type between UDP and TCP right here. And then byte ordering, we'll just do native. So let's go ahead and click apply and OK to make sure those changes save. So now let's go ahead and jump into that README, because this is really all that we need to talk about as far as this experiment's concerned. But it's also important that we set up the other experiment as well, or that other application, to actually read in these signals. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on README. Now it says this experiment's configured to be run on a single machine with ePrime 3 and the ePrime socket device tester.exe, which is that application right here. So it says the socket device is set to localhost on port 4900 using UDP. Port 4900 is chosen at random. We, of course, don't really want to show you guys our IP addresses, those types of things. But it says you may use another port if you wish. It says make sure to open and configure the ePrime socket device tester. And then it tells you exactly how to set up that tester program. So we go ahead and open that up just to get it to receive data. Now, if you look, it looks very, very simple here. So it says configure the ePrime socket tester. Click R to receive. So I'll be sending, and this will be receiving. I'll be receiving UDP type communication. and on port number 4900. So I go ahead and hit enter here. So it says the socket is now receiving. So basically now my socket, and I'll keep just those up there. So it says the socket is now receiving. It says press Control C or Control Break to stop receiving. So now I've basically set up a socket in ePrime that's just going to sit here and listen to anything that's sent across this port. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run this experiment in windowed mode so I can have them kind of side by side here. So if I go ahead and click run and click test, I get my little windowed mode experiment window there. So I'm going to have this on one side. So it just says experiment will send strings via task events. And I'll go ahead and resize this so we can see both on the same screen. And then if I go ahead and press any key to begin, it says sending data. And if I look over here, it says data received. And it received my sent at onset, it received my sent at 250, and it received my sent at 500. And then we go ahead and press any key to exit, and then I will press, after it gets out of that, go ahead and go back into here. And then it says I'll press Control C to stop listening to the port there. So I press Control C, do it one more time just in case, and go ahead and exit out of that program. So now I'm no longer waiting to receive data through that external program. Now, what we do recommend, if you, so that's a good example of how you would send signals and then how you would receive the signals. And if you want to see how they look, it's a really good tester program. So we do recommend using that as kind of a troubleshooting step if you are sending socket signals and you're like, well, how do I know it's working? That's how you know it's working. But if you really want to make sure that it's working correctly, we actually mention a program specifically in here. It's called a packet sniffer. And what that is something called Wireshark. Now, Wireshark is one of the applications we actually use internally. And what it does is it actually listens for any type of UDP or TCP packets that are coming across whatever port you tell it. And then it'll tell you when it came in and with what quality. It's actually a really great application for that. So if you don't necessarily want to use our socket device test that we have there, you can definitely use something like Wireshark, and we actually do recommend that to debug any sort of network communications that you're doing, just to make sure that the packets are coming in correctly. And if there's ever kind of a breakdown in communication, you're like, well, I set my ePrime experiment up right, the other thing isn't getting it, you can use something like Wireshark to determine where that fault might be happening. So is the fault in ePrime sending the packets? Is it a fault in the other program receiving the packets? That's something that we can that'll be really helpful. So we definitely recommend that one. All right, so now that we have our send UDP here, I'm going to go ahead and close this program. Now we'll show you receiving UDP communication, and this is the part that we really updated. We really updated in ePrime 3, and this is going to be a little more involved than sending UDP. Not quite as much, but you'll see. So while we wait for it to open, just know that I am using the latest build of ePrime 3. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier, what I was talking about when I said, in the latest build, that's ePrime 3 Update 1 or ePrime version 3.0.3.60. So that's really what we recommend if you're going to be doing these types of things. Now, like the last one, this one has a README, but I'll just go straight through the experiment structure for you guys. So this has a little README that we're going to get to at the end because it'll talk about the external application as well. I have my introduction, which says the ePrime socket device test.exe will send data as soon as it's connected. You may notice that the first loop contains multiple test number entries. Press any key to begin. And then I have this receiving data. And what this is going to do is it's going to be showing the word receiving. And then I just say this will show the last data received. And then press any key to exit. So instead of the words this will show the last data received, we're actually going to be updating that text display with the data that was received from that socket device tester. And then we have some loop script. Now what the loop script is going to do is it's actually just going to sit and it's going to wait until it receives a signal from the packet or from the socket device, and it's going to just increment whenever it gets something from it. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at the script here. So the first thing we're doing is we're actually defining these two variables, nRead and string response. These are actually what's going to be the bulk of our socket communication. I'll show you how those are used a little later. And the next thing we do is we actually take a look at a variable or define a variable called the slide text, and then set it to the receiving data slide text or slide object there .activeObjects.response. And if you take a look here, that's actually what this slide text sub object is. It's called response. So in here, we're basically just making a shortcut called the slide text that gains access to that slide sub object, and we'll use that later to update it with the information that we get from the socket device. And here you see just a very simple do while loop on lines 8 and 23. So it just means that E prime is going to sit in this loop and go over and over and over and spin until receiving data input masks is pending. So what this means is it's waiting for you to press a button on receiving data to end it. It says press any key to exit. And if I take a look here, my duration input tab, I have a keyboard mask with a time limit set to infinite because that input mask needs to still be active after that 0 millisecond duration that is set on this slide object, and it's just going to be active while this loop is going and going and going and going. So then whenever I press a key, the input mask is no longer pending, it is terminated, and that means that E prime is then going to get out of this loop object. So while we're in here, it says make sure we receive data. So if socket.inputCount is greater than 0, this input count property here on that socket device is just going to tell you how much we've received from the socket. So if it is greater than 0, that means we've received more than no packets of information. So we've received at least one packet of information. And then we're setting this variable here called nRead, which is just an integer, to socket.readString. So socket.readString, all it's doing is just reading strings worth of data that's coming in through the socket device, and it's setting it to this string response string that we have here. So that read string is just going to increment the number of strings that it's received, and the string response is going to tell us what we've actually gotten. And then it says, if we have valid data, let's print it out. So if nRead is greater than 0, because here we have if socket input count is greater than 0, so if we receive some packet, nRead is if we've read a string worth of data from that socket device, which means nRead will be greater than 0. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and first we're going to do a debug.print, which is going to show up in this output window. But more importantly, and honestly a little more fun, we're actually going to set the text of that response slide text sub object to that string response string that we had made in the beginning, which is actually going to be what was sent from the socket device. And then we're going to do a slide text.draw. And the reason that we're doing that is just going to update the screen with whatever data we got from the socket device. Without that slide text.draw, the screen wouldn't actually change. And the only way we'd be able to see those sockets coming in is that debug.print data if we take a look at this output window here. And then we just have it sleep for 1 millisecond. And then once it's out of the loop, we have it sleep for 500 milliseconds, just to allow a little bit more time before we're closing that socket communication. Now, there's one other important part that I do want to bring up, because the script is what's really driving the bulk of this. This is really what's driving how we're communicating with this socket device, and that's really the most important part here. But if we take a look at the experiment object, I want to draw your attention to the startup info. Now, if you take a look down at the very bottom here, we have a new startup info parameter that we've added, and we literally just added this by clicking add and then typing a name of a startup info parameter that we want. But it is socket.udp receive server. Now, this is really important when communicating with the UDP and receiving UDP communications in ePrime3. This is the most important part of this. If you take a look here, the socket or these startup info parameters actually end up allowing you to use that dot there, and that's how you would make that startup info parameter socket.udp receive server. And what we're doing is we're entering the host name of the receiving machine. And in this case, we're going to set it to a default of 127.0.0.1. And I'm going to show you why once we go ahead and open up that other program, because this IP address is actually what we're going to be plugging into that other host program. So ePrime knows now that we're going to be listening on this port. And that's why we're really setting this up, is because if you think back to that pen example that I used with Brian, when I kind of threw all the pens at him, Brian didn't know what pen to catch, just like UDP communication doesn't necessarily know what IP address it's going to be listening for. This startup info parameter is going to be telling ePrime exactly what IP address it's listening for these packets here. And it's kind of like me telling Brian, catch the blue pen, when I threw all the pens at him. And then max length, that could be 100. That's fine. That just means there's going to be 100 characters here. But again, the most important part is this default value right here. Now, if you find that on this computer, I have a lot of programs that are really interacting with this socket device, and it's really a pain for me to make this startup info parameter on every single one of my experiments, and I'm doing it over and over again, and it's really annoying. What you can do is you can use these startup info files that we have here. So if you click on edit global values, What this does is it makes a global startup info parameter that is not going to show up in this list here, but is going to be referenced by every ePrime experiment run on this computer and consequently on this username. Now what I could do is instead of having it right here, I can actually have the property name socket.udp receive server. I can type that into right here, and then I can have my value set to that IP address that I want to have it listen to. That way every computer on this, or every ePrime experiment on this computer, is going to be listening for the same or through the same socket. And you can just set that up ahead of time if you happen to be the IT person at your lab, or you happen to be the lab coordinator. This might be a very useful tool for you, so I do recommend checking that out. And you can do the same thing here with edit local values, but just know that it's every experiment within this folder and not every experiment or every ePrime experiment on the computer. So if you have a couple of experiments in the same folder that are listening from the same or for the same or through the same socket, then you would do that edit local values. Otherwise, if every experiment is going to, then you would do edit global values. But if it's kind of a one-off, you only have one experiment that's really listening, we do recommend using the startup info parameters up here. So it's entirely up to you. But that is one of the most important parts. And if we hop over to our devices here, we can take a look at our socket. And as you can see here, our socket name is socket, our server is set to localhost, and our port is set to 1900. Again, connection type is of course UDP, and byte ordering we're going to keep at native. There we go. So that's really all that we did to set up socket device communication in here. So now ePrime is going to be reading the packets that external program is set up. So now that I've kind of gone over what we have in the actual structure of the experiment, let's go over that README file. So right here it says make sure to open and configure the ePrime socket device tester prior to running the experiment. Important to know. It's easiest to watch both applications running in windowed mode, which I had already done, but is always a good reminder. And let's go ahead and configure that socket device tester again. So we're going to go ahead and open that. And in this case, let's go ahead and take a look at these instructions here. We're actually going to use this to send. So we press S, it's going to be UDP. The port number is going to be 4900. Whoops, my number lock was off. 4900. And then my IP address is going to be 127.0.0.1. And then if I go ahead and hit enter, what it's going to do is it's going to say socket is now sending once per second. So let's go ahead and fire up the ePrime experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and click test. We'll just do 1, 1, and we're going to keep all of those by default. So I have 1, 1, and then you saw really quickly, I'll go through that again. This is that last startup info parameter that I have. It says enter the host name of receiving data machine. I'm going to keep it at 127.0.0.1 because in this program, that's what I have it set up to. So that's going to be the IP address, and I have the IP address set up here as well. They match, perfect. So let's go ahead and click OK. Continue the above startup info, yes. So we're going to go ahead and put that over there. And we have this application that is still sending. We'll go ahead and minimize this a little bit. And we're going to go ahead and press any key to begin. And as you can see, I waited a little while, so it's been about 50 seconds since I started, or almost a minute of me explaining things. But as you can see, this is sending once per second, and once per second, my test is updating. So it's going 62, 63, 64. So this is now receiving data from this program here. So this is another quick and easy way to kind of test whether or not your communication is working. And just keep in mind that all that this program is doing is it's just sending a number. It's just incrementing it over and over again. This isn't meant to do any more like complex sending strings or anything like that. All it's really doing is just sending you a different number and incrementing that number. It's just meant to be just a very, very easy kind of, quick and dirty, hey, let's make sure my socket device works kind of test. Go ahead and click any key to exit, and I will. I'm going to go ahead and stop communication here by hitting Control-C. So now it's not sending signals once per second. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of that and click exit one more time. And that's really all that I have as far as sending and receiving UDP communication is concerned. We tried to make it as simple as possible in ePrime. And really the main thing to keep in mind here is that if you're receiving UDP type communication, it's important to have that startup info parameter right there. So that's really all that is included in that experiment. If you go ahead and take a look at, I'm going to open up this. This is actually included, this sample that I referenced. It is in this knowledge base article. It's just called Socket Communication in ePrime 3. We try to name it as simply as possible. If you scroll down to the very bottom, it's just in a little zip file here. So ePrime 3 Socket Communication Samples. And if you go ahead and download it, it's just going to have a zip archive, and I'm going to show you what's included. So you go ahead and get that receive UDP and send UDP information. But you also end up getting receiving and sending TCP information. The reason I focused on UDP today is because it is arguably the more complex of the two, because receiving UDP or TCP type information, since it is or does have that handshake, or simply handing that pen like I did with Brian, it doesn't necessarily need that startup info parameter, because it's just going to know that it's looking at that single IP address instead of trying to listen to all of them at the same time. So that's why we included these experiments, so you can kind of see the difference between the two. And these are going to be really great starting points if you guys are doing an experiment on your own and you guys maybe need to implement some TCP or IP or TCP or UDP in communication into your experiment. This is just a very quick and easy way to say, okay, well, here's the script and this is basically how I'm going to edit this part. So it'll be really good starting points for that portion of your experiment if that's something that you need. And I'm hoping that this video kind of does a good job of demonstrating that as well. But know that the video does go along with these files. I kind of try to pair the videos along with the associated any sort of files that we have, just so we have a little bit more information instead of just like a knowledge base article and then these files, and you might not know what to do with any of them. This video is going to do hopefully a good job of explaining that to you guys. So that's really all the information we have for today on sending ePrime communications in ePrime 3. Know that we do have an associated article that's socket device communication in ePrime 2 and includes some very similar files. So it's going to show you how to do these things in ePrime 2 if you are an ePrime 2 user. I do recommend checking that out as well. That's going to be a really great resource for you too. But aside from that, that's really all I have. Thank you guys very much for watching. Have a great Thursday. And, feel free to like and subscribe to our page. It really helps us keep doing what we're doing here. So if you like this video, give it a like, share it with your friends, those kinds of things. So thank you guys very much, and have a great day.